Thank you.
Anneliese Dodds.
Thank you, Sir George. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate with you in the chair, and I'm also very grateful to everyone who signed both petitions, and also grateful to my honourable friend Gower for the respectful way in which she began this debate. I think it's very clear from the two petitions that form the subject of this discussion that there are strongly held views around this issue, as well as from the very large numbers of people who signed them. It is vital that the members of this House set an example on these matters and engage in constructive, respectful and polite discussion on these matters. Now, this discussion is important because, as well as the engagement we've seen on these petitions, relatedly, many are seeking clarity about the Conservative government's plans for the Equality Act. That includes my party, the Labour Party, the party of the Equality Act. It is now 13 years, as many have remarked, since my right honourable friend for Peckham and Camberwell piloted that landmark legislation through this place, introducing, of course, a legal framework against discrimination by employers, businesses, schools, public bodies and many other institutions that many other countries lack and still seek to learn from. Yes, I'll give way.
My honourable friend is making a very powerful point about the Equality Act, and I agree that it's been protecting people for 13 years in a whole range of areas, not just in relation to gender identity, but in terms of race, in terms of age, in terms of protection on breastfeeding, on disability, so many other areas. Does she share my concern that there is a wider agenda here from the Conservative government? The Prime Minister said that the Equality Act was a Trojan horse that has allowed every kind of woke nonsense to permeate public life. And does she not agree that there's a wider agenda here to remove all the protections which we all enjoy?
Well, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right to point out there's huge confusion about the government's position on this. We heard those comments from the Prime Minister last summer. We've also heard in 2020 the then Minister for Women and Equalities criticising what she claimed to be a focus on protected characteristics, saying that had led to a narrowing of the equality debate. A similar position has been maintained by her successor. And yet, confusingly, we've also had then the Prime Minister claiming to back the protections that the Equality Act contains for women. I think to listen to him, you wouldn't think these protections had already been enshrined in law for 13 years, a law which, of course, his party opposed repeatedly when it was passed. And this is important context, Sir George, because we cannot understand the government's intentions when we have a Prime Minister who will attack the Equality Act one day only to cast himself as its defender the next. And today I can be very clear that Labour remains committed to protecting and upholding the Equality Act, including the public sector equality duty, its protected characteristics and its provision for single-sex exemptions. So I want to ask the Minister if she can be clear in her remarks, does she support the Equality Act? Does she agree that statements attacking it from her colleagues risk eroding public confidence in its protections? And will she commit to explaining to her colleagues, including the Prime Minister, that the overwhelming consensus view of the British public is in favour of those protections of greater equality and fairness? Now, on the specificities of future changes that many have talked about during this discussion, as the Party of Equality, Labour wants trans people to be treated fairly and with dignity and respect. And Labour also supports the protection of certain spaces that are for biological women, such as, for example, refuges for vulnerable women, which are provided for by the single-sex exemptions contained in the Equality Act. Indeed, it's thanks to Labour's Equality Act that it is possible today for service providers to create and maintain single-sex services where that's a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. That system has been in place for well over a decade, and many of the service providers I speak to tell me it does provide an effective and robust framework for dealing with what are often difficult decisions around service operation. And we can see that, I believe, in codified form in, for example, Women's Aid England's guidance on these matters. Now, the Equality Act protects everyone, and that's why any changes to it need to be carefully thought through, and why clarity on these issues is important. Now, Labour believes we need to have a common sense approach that provides clarity for service providers for different circumstances, both those circumstances when trans people should be included and those circumstances where excluding trans people is a proportionate means to a legitimate end. But the problem is that the government has provided no indication of how it would provide that clarity. Aside from leaning into the idea of amending the Equality Act itself, something that actually contradicts its written response to today's petitions. I hope the Minister can set the record straight on this today. This is especially important, given that we've heard contradictory statements on this subject from different parts of her government. Now, some colleagues have already referred, I think helpfully, to the recent exchange of letters between the Government Equalities Office and the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. The chair of the EHRC made clear that any potential future changes to the Equality Act could bring clarity to some areas, but potential ambiguity to others. That's why the government, again, needs to urgently explain what future changes, if any, it's in the process of identifying, and why it must also set out whether it agrees with the HRC that such changes could bring greater ambiguity to other areas, and if so, what the impact of that would be for anyone with a protected characteristic. Detailed policy and legal analysis is clearly required before the UK government can effectively respond to the AHRC's letter. So can the Minister confirm whether that detailed policy and legal analysis is being carried out? If so, will she commit today to publishing it so that the House can scrutinise the government's position on these matters? And will she confirm whether or not the government does plan to reply to the AHRC? And when the government comes forward with any proposals out of all of the rumours we've heard in the press, Labour will respond accordingly. The last Labour government did more to advance the cause of equality than any other in history. The next will put equality at the heart of its policies and break new ground for women and for LGBT+ people. And in that connection, in concluding, Sir George, I have to associate myself with the remarks made by my friend for Birmingham Yardley in relation to recent votes on legislation. And I have to broaden her point. We've seen extensive engagement on government benches on these issues, the issues of discussion today. We do need to discuss them. We need to do that politely. We need to do that in detail. But I wish we'd seen, over the last 13 years, the same level of engagement on the government benches while so many women got poorer and poorer, why so many women saw their health deteriorate with now maternal mortality increasing, while so many women and girls have become increasingly unsafe, and while impunity for violent men has in many cases increased. Thank you, Sir George.
Minister Maria Caulfield.
Thank you, Sir George. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'm grateful